Okay, Rabosai, welcome. We are not a long ways out until we finish the Masechta. I hope you received my email, but in case you did not, Sunday morning, 9:30 a.m., February 26th, we will, God willing, be Messiahing Maseches Megillah together, assuming, everything should go well and smooth and we should keep to our schedule. That's when it is projected. And if somehow we miss a week between then and now, we'll have to make up for it. So we find ourselves tonight on the top of Chaf Tes Amud Aleph, on the top of 29a. Well, not quite at the top, actually. We're actually maybe more or less a quarter way down at Tanya. We're at a Brisa. This is actually a really nice note to start off on. So just about a quarter ways down, Tanya Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai Omer. Take a moment to find it. If anyone wants to tell us whether it's the first section or second section in the art scroll, you can let us know. I'm going to guess it might be roughly toward the end of the first section, if I have to guess. But you guys find it? Tanya Rabbi Shimon Yochai Omer. Rabbi Simon, son of Yohai, said. I don't know how they translate that. Okay, here we go. Tanya Rabbi Shimon Yochai Omer. Bo re'eh kama chavivin Yisrael v'nei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Come and see how precious the Jewish people are to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Shebachol makom shegalu shechina imahen. Because wherever we find ourselves exiled, the divine presence goes into exile with us. A very powerful idea. Go to Mitzrayim, when we had to go down to Egypt, very relevant for the Parshios that we're in right now. So Shechina imahen, the Shechina went with us. Shneimar, and Neglesi lebeis avicha beyosem b'Mitzrayim. So we see from the pasuk here that God went down to Egypt along with the Jewish people, along with Yaakov and his family. Go to Bavel, and when we were exiled to Babylonia, Shechina imahen, so too the divine presence went with us. Shneimar L'manchem shalachti bavela. So for your sake, I've sent myself with you to Bavel. Not only does God join us when we are sent into exile to comfort us, but certainly God ushers us back in, and divine presence comes with us to when we are welcomed back. Shenamar v'shav Hashem Elokecha es shuseich v'shiv lo nemar, doesn't say the Heshiv that God causes to return. Ela v'shav malame shakadosh baruch hu shavi mami beis hagalios. This indicates that God Himself was returning with us when we came back from the exile. Now the question is, okay, fine. So that's the end of that idea. On a related note, since we said that the divine presence went with the Jewish people into the Babylonian exile, right? So the question is, where do we find it nowadays? So what's interesting about this next piece of Gemara is that it's assuming that the idea of the Shekhinah going out with us is not just a metaphorical idea, but we're going to see soon that there was a belief that the Shekhinah actually had to find some place to rest amongst those who were in the Babylonian exile, or I guess the next one not the first one really, but actually we're talking about the Talmud Bavli when the Jews are in Babel, not from the first Beis HaMikdash. The Bavel Heicha. So where can we find it nowadays in Bavel? Amar Abaye bebei Knishta de Hutzal u bebei Knishta de Shafi Yatz ben Harda. It's found in either the shul that's found in Hutzal or in the shul that was uprooted and resettled in Naharda, which of course that's where all the rabbis were hanging out. By the way, I just noticed the language here. I remember we had our shiur on national flags in shul. So we quoted a Gemara, and I believe the Gemara used a similar language. It talked about it in Darta, which was kind of like a bust of the king, that they had to place it inside the shul. And I think it was actually talking about this exact shul, the one that the base Knisha, the Shafi Yosef ben Harda, that was reconstituted in Naharda in Babylonia. So I'm just noticing, I think it's the same shul that we saw in that Gemara that we're talking about over here. Anyway, that's where the divine presence can be found. However, veloti mahacha v'hacha, but we do not think to say that the Shekhinah can be found at both shuls simultaneously, because that would have undertones of perhaps there being more than one God, of two deities. The divine presence kind of hangs out a little bit over here, and then it makes its rounds to the next shul. And so Amar Abai Tasili, we saw this language earlier. Reward should come to me. That because even when I was a parsa away, I would go up to daven at these places. So just a quick elaboration halachically what's going on over here. There's a halacha that we can derive from this. The halacha is that when someone is traveling, so they're expected, if there's a shul that's out, even if it's out of their way, you're expected to travel up to a mill to go out of your way to daven with a minyan. So a mill, it's a big dispute exactly where, but we assume it's about roughly 18 minutes worth of travel time. However, one would have to travel even further for that, 4 times that amount, in order to, if it's in a direction that you're heading already. So basically the point that Abai, I believe, is teaching us is that he went even further out of his way to daven at these shuls than he would have been required to, just from a minyan standpoint. I think that's a possible read of what's going on over here. Or he had a minyan, but he just wanted Dafka to daven at these shuls. Okay. Now, Avua the Shmuel Ulevi have a Yasi Beknishta, the Shavi Yasi ben Harda. So the Father Shmuel and Levi were hanging out at this shul that was reconstituted in Naharda. And then, what do you know? Asya Shechina comes along the divine presence and makes its way, whatever this means, makes its way into the shul. Shamu kol riksha. They heard a rustling as the Shekhinah came in. It's not just this metaphorical idea. The actual presence of the Shekhinah was there. Kamu v'nafku, so they said, well, we're not interested in, apparently the Shekhinah wants to be here right now. We should clear out and make room for the Shekhinah to come in. That's what they did. However, in a similar instance, Rav Sheshes Rav Sheshes was sitting at this shul in Naharda, and same thing happens. Asya Shechina comes in the divine presence, below nafak, but he did not move. Asu malachi ashari zakamavasule. The ministering angels were not too happy. They saw this as an affront to God's dignity. If the Shekhinah is here, what right do you have to be in here right now? Amar Lefanav, so Rashashis turns to God and says, Ribono Sha'olam, Olav Usha'eno Olav, Mi Nidcha Mipnei Mi. Someone who is, despondent, or you could give me what the official article translation, someone who's down, someone who's despondent, someone who doesn't have things going well for him. And someone who isn't Aluv, who should leave before whom? In other words, Rashashis, Rashi tells us, he was a Sagi Nahor, he was blind. That's a classic, that's the paradigmatic euphemism. There's something called Lashon Sagi Nahar, which is a euphemism in Talmudic parlance. Lashon Sagi Nahar, the language of Sagi Nahar means someone who has a lot of light in his eyes. That's a euphemism for someone who is blind. So that's the paradigmatic euphemism used in the Talmud. So anytime we want to call something euphemism, we don't have a special word for it. We call it a Lashon Sagi Nahar. So Rashashis says, I'm the blind man over here. If the angels could go find another place for themselves. Leave me alone. And Arahu Shavku. And indeed, the Shekhinah says to the angels, leave him be. Why should we trouble this man who is blind to have to leave the shul at this point?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Forgive me, what's the problem philosophically with the Shekhinah being in more than one place? Are we trying to limit God's ability?
So yeah, I guess part of the question we have to ask is what exactly the Shekhinah is, to what degree. It seems to be some form of quasi-physical or metaphysical manifestation of God in the world. So it's funny because on the one hand, this itself is subject to philosophical dispute. We have the classic Moshe song, Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. I'm relearning it right now because every time we ask Talia, where's Hashem? She says, up, up. And we're like, yeah, but down, down. She didn't get all the other directions. She just says up, up. So yeah, it's something that it's interesting to look into about what exactly the Shekhinah is, because we have an idea of the Shekhinah rest. There's a further issue over here, by the way, also, because you look in Pirkei Avos, we talk about, or not forget about Pirkei Avos. Anytime we talk about a minion, we say there's a minion of men, the Shekhinah rests with them. Well, I got news for you. There's more than just a mini going on at Good Hashem. There's minyanim going on at multiple shuls at the same time throughout the world. So what does it mean? So it's interesting to see, what do we mean when we say the word Shekhinah? It seems to be that it sometimes refers to this actual manifestation of God or something, and there are other times that the Shekhinah might mean something more metaphorical. But what your point is that if God can be in multiple places at once, why is it so disturbing to think that the Shekhinah can be in multiple places at once? It's a good question. I'm not sure. Any suggestions?
I think the soft part of the Shekhinah is the soft, the forgiving, the accepting part of God.
Yeah, like the feminine.
Yes,
feminine qualities.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Sadie, you're going to say something?
Yeah. The Shekhinah went into exile with us. Keep in mind that there have always been some small amount of Jews in the Holy Land, which means the territory occupied by the 10 tribes on the West Bank to the Mediterranean. The bulk of the Jews were in exile either in Europe or in what is now called the Muslim world. There was two different exiles, really. And then after World War II, we had the major, or actually it started after World War I, the major return of the Jews to Israel. And we have a major population there, but we still have a major population right here in the United States, and to a lesser extent in other parts of the world. And the Shekhinah is presumably either in Israel or it's in the exile, unless the Shekhinah is in both places at the same time. But I like to compare the term in Star Wars, the Force, and I like to think of Hashem as being the Force, which is everywhere.
Very good. I like the Star Wars analogy. See, you can teach the kids these days.
Right?
Even all the new Star Wars are I'm not machshav for those. Okay, very good. Let's go forward, Rabosai. We're going through a number of fundamental Gemaras that you've probably heard in like a Shabbos morning sermon, but now you're gonna actually see it in the Gemara. Vahila hem lemikdash ma'at. God says, and I'll be to them a mikdash ma'at, a miniature temple. This refers to the synagogues and the Bati Midrashim of Bavel that we call our shuls a mikdash ma'at. They're considered a miniature based on mikdash. Rabbi Elazar Amar Zed based Rabbeinu Shev Bavel. This refers to the house of Rav in Bavel. That's his alternative reading of it, because he was the one who really kept Torah going in the diaspora. Darash Rava, Ma'id Siv Hashem on Atahayisa Lanu. So what does it mean that God will be an abode for us? Bati Knesios and Bati Midrashos. Elu Bati Knesios and Bati Midrashos. This refers to the shuls and base medrashes. Amar Abaye, Meireish Hava Garisna Bebesa. So Thursday morning, folks. We did this one recently, by the way. Amar Abaye, Meireish Hava Garisna Bebesa, Matzlina Bebe Knishna. I used to learn at home and I used to pray at shul. Came at the Shema Slaha to Kamar David Hashem Ahavti Ma'on Beisecha. When I came by this pasuk in Tehillim, in which David Hamel says, Hashem, I love your abode, your house. Having Garisma Be'Kanishta, I recognize that it's worthwhile going to shul to learn rather than just learning at my home. So there's a value. You know what this is similar to? It's like we said last week, that is a value to spending time in shul, even if you're doing nothing. Remember, we said if you need to go into a shul to get somebody, and somehow you can't even read a pasuk for the life of you. So nonetheless, you sit there for a few moments, soak in the atmosphere of the Beis HaKnesses, and then go on forward. So there's a value, even though I'm speaking to myself over here as well. I like to sometimes prepare my shiurim from home because there's less distractions sometimes. I know no one's gonna walk in and try to get me for something, so I can actually sit down for an hour and go straight through. Nonetheless, this is a good muster for myself as well. I guess a good muster for all. That it's good to learn inside the shul when we're able to do that. Okay.
If I might add, learning inside the shul, if you're learning with somebody, I think you can learn better with a chavrusa than you can by yourself, or maybe with a whole group, because you get the chance to exchange different ideas and debate ideas.
Yeah, there's definitely gemaras that talk about that one who learns on his own is, I think in Titus it comes up and talks about that. One of the arguments that's made is that nowadays, even though there's always a benefit to hearing other views, if you're just trying to understand the Gemara, what better chavrusa than Rabbi Dr. Arthur Scroll? So that's what some have argued. Anyway, moving forward. Tanya Rabbi Elazar HaKapar Omer Asidin Bate Knesset Bate Midrash Bavel Sheyikvu Be'eretz Yisrael. In the future, all the shuls, all the Bate Midrashos of Bavel will be reconstituted in the Holy Land. Shnemar Ki Tabor Bahar Carmel B'Yam Yavo. So what does it mean? Why are we talking about these two mountains, the Mount Tabor and the Carmel? But Torah but the Kinesios about the Midrash Kormar beats man Torah alagatz kama v'kama. What did we just read? So there's two ways to understand this. According to our Girsa, to our text of the Gemara, these two mountains came to learn Torah at Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, when the Torah was given. The other way to read it, which we're going to actually see in just a moment, is that they didn't really come to learn Torah, but they actually came to dispute Har Sinai's candidacy as the mountain to receive the Torah. But nonetheless, we see that if these mountains could be moved in order to learn Torah, certainly our shuls, which are not just temporary but permanently being relocated to Eretz Yisrael, we could rest assured that that will happen in the end of days. Darash bar Kafra, Ma'id Siv, Lama Tirtzedun Harim Givnonim, Yatsa Baskov Amr Lahem. A heavenly voice came out and said to these mountains, Lama Tirtzedinim Sinai. Why do you have these grievances with Har Sinai being selected to receive the Torah? Kulchem Bali Mumim Atem Eitzel Sinai. You are all considered to be blemished in contrast to Har Sinai. How do we see this? Siv Hacha Gavnunim, Siv Hasam O Gavan Odak. That we see the word Gavan is considered one of the Mumim. That's one of the blemishes that would disqualify a Kohen from service. So the same shoresh of Gimel Beis Nun appears in referring to these mountains, that they too are blemished. Now, what was their blemish? Their blemish was their haughtiness, that they were so tall, and they said, I'm the tallest mountain, so I should receive the Torah. And of course, the Torah goes to Har Sinai because of its humility. Amar Avashi, Shma Mina, we can infer from here, Yahir Bal Mumhu, anyone who is haughty, anyone who is arrogant, is considered to be a blemished individual. Okay. end of the Agadata. All right, we've been having lots of fun. Let's get back to the nuts and bolts. Let's get some halacha in over here. Enos Kapandria, we established that you're not supposed to use the shul or the base medrash as a shortcut. To my Kapandria, that's a funny word. It's a fun word, right, guys? Well, what's this word Kapandria? Amarava Kapandria Kishma. It's what it sounds like. The Gemara says, Shkoyach, my Kishma. What does it sound like? Tell me. What's the word Kapandria? Where do you get this from? Honestly, it sounds like a Greek word if I had to guess. Anyway, Kaman. So fine. Kaman de Amar Ademakifna Dari Ayul Baha. There's a saying that someone will say, why am I bothering circling all of these buildings? Let me just cut through this house over here in order to get from point A to point B, rather than being makif, rather than like hakafos, rather than making a circle, taking a circuitous route. So it's apparently a contraction between adamakifna adari, that when you put the letters of those words together and you situate them in a certain way, it's the same letters that make up the word kapandria. So kapandria is short form for this statement about taking shortcuts. Anyway, now that we know the etymology of the word, let's get back to the halachic matters. Here are a few exceptions to the rule. If there was already a path, if this was a thoroughfare, and then you decide to build a Beis HaKnesses where this thoroughfare is, people are still allowed to use it as a thoroughfare. It's only disrespectful if it was first a shul and then you're turning the shul into a thoroughfare. Next, Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, hanichnas al mashal lasis kapandria, mutar lasos kapandria. One who enters in not for the purpose of using it as a shortcut, you are then, you spend some time learning Torah or saying sukkah, like we said, you could then enter in permissibly, and then you can exit in whatever direction you want. Similarly, anyone who goes to shul to daven, you don't have to take the same way out. You're allowed to take a more convenient exit. Shnemar. And in Yecheskel, it describes the people who come to worship Hashem during the festivals, and it says, black on white, people would come in through the northern gate, and they would prostrate before God, and then they would leave out the southern gate. So you don't have to be this. You're not supposed to use the shul as a convenience, but at the same time, you don't dafka have to use it as an inconvenience either if you went in under permissible circumstances. Okay. Next.
Question, Rabbi.
Yes, John.
You may have just answered my question, but I'll pose it anyway. When you're exiting the shul, do you have an obligation to go out the longest way or the shortest way?
Exiting the shul, I don't think you need to take the longest route, but there is something similar about when someone gets an aliyah to the Torah. So you're supposed to take a longer route back to demonstrate that you don't want to leave the Torah, that you're reluctant. For some people, they take the longer route because that's their victory lap. So
You circle the bima and get a candy, and you get a candy from Irwin.
yeah, exactly. He shakes your hand, and then you're like, "Oh, now I have this candy. What do I do with it?" Right, Erwin? No, I'm kidding. Yes, but see, you got to save it for Kiddush. That's the hardest part, Erwin, is that you tempt us with the candies, and then meanwhile, I have to. Well, I guess it depends when you have your Kiddush, right? You're counting on us. Okay. We're not going to get to the 8:00 Kiddush Club politics here.
That reminds me, Rabbi, of what Rabbi Cohen is always saying. Don't rush to take your talit off. Wait until wait until the service is over. It's not over until Adon Olam is finished.
That's not even my fight at 8 a.m. I'm like, wrap up your talit, but wrap up your mouth also. That's where we're at. I usually say at the end of the 8 a.m. meeting something to the effect of, You know, in a moment, we're going to be saying the most beloved prayer of our liturgy, Adon Olam, followed by which we conclude the surface. Some people get the idea. Some people don't want to get the idea. All right. Anyway,
Rabbi, in almost 50 years, thank God I've never run out.
Oh, those candies. It's very tempting because I have to get
And also the liquid stuff also.
The liquid candy.
Very good. All right, Rabosai. Final section until the Mishnah. Okay. Alubo asavim lo yitlosh me agmas nefesh. As we said earlier, that when grass grows in a shul that's no longer operational, one is not supposed to mow it. One's not supposed to pluck out the grass that's growing. But there's a brayso that says you're only not allowed to pluck out the grass to use the grass to feed your animals. But if you want to just tidy up the place, you're allowed to do that. So the Gemara concedes that indeed our Mishnah only prohibits detaching the grass when you are then going to use it to feed your animals. You're like, oh, it's a great idea. I could just leave this shul unoperational and then take the grass and pasture my animals. So, however, if you're just removing the grass to tidy it up a little bit, that would seem to be okay, which kind of minimizes the agmas nefesh factor when you think about it. Okay, final part. Tanar Rabbanan, Beis Hakvara. Marissa, everything okay? Okay. Tanar Rabbanan, Beis Hakvaros, Ein Noagim Bahen Kalus Rosh, Ein Mar Bahen Behima, Vein Malichim Bahen Amasmayim, Vein Malak Ben Asavim. Okay, so let's bring this down. In a cemetery, one is not allowed to have Kalus Rosh. I will translate as frivolous for now, but as we've noted previously, Paul, you brought this up in the past, it would seem to be more expansive than just frivolity. One should not graze their animals, have their animals graze, pasture there, and one should not bring direct water into it, and one should not collect the grass. And if someone does actually collect the grass, so then they would have to burn it now, and then seemingly because of honoring the dead. So which the Gemara asks, I don't get it. Why is burning the grass helpful for the dead? So Ella Aresha, that statement, that clause, I guess, of kavod hamesim, of respecting and honoring the deceased, is referring to the first part of the brayso, which says, do not have kalus rosh in a cemetery because of kavod hamesim. Okay? That brings us to the Mishnah. Now, I want to, before we jump on to our next topic, I want to bring out our good friend, the Birchas Avram over here, who have I ever shared this phrase with you? There's a phrase that comes up many times in yeshivish parlance, which the phrase goes that sometimes the kasha is better than the teretz. Sometimes the question is better than the answer. So this is one of those cases. The Birchas Avram asked the following question. As we just read, one is not supposed to have Kalus Rosh in a cemetery. Sarach Bir. Why do we have to give more respect to the deceased than to those who are alive? In other words, I'm allowed to eat and drink in the presence of you guys. So why is it any more disrespectful for me to eat and drink when I am at a cemetery? Right? It happens sometimes for me that sometimes here we have a good Hashem cemetery, so things are local. But many times, I'll have to go out to Queens or have to go out to Westchester. And then by the time I get there, I'm like, oh, wow, I missed lunch. So I might have like a kind bar in my pocket and I want to pop it in while I'm at the cemetery. But I'm not supposed to do that. So
is it possible it's because the dead can't join in
Very good. Very good. So there are two possibilities. Is this a din in a Beit HaKvaros? Is this a prohibition of that relates to cemetery as a place? or I don't know, let's say I just found a lone grave of somebody. Would it pertain to him? It would seem that this isn't a special idea that's unique to a cemetery in. Okay. This isn't a place that's unique to a cemetery in particular, but it would apply even to if there's just a single individual. Now, this is because of a principle. It comes up in Brachos, I'm sure other places, of being loeg l'rash, which one basically shouldn't do things. The example that comes up in the Gemara is that one shouldn't be dragging their tzitzis along the graves because it's kind of sticking it in their faces that you're performing a mitzvah while they're no longer able to perform mitzvahs. So there's a question. Erwin, you got credit for this one. So Erwin asked me the following question. We and I think a number of you were with us at Levi the other day at a Gershom cemetery. And the issue is, I mean, this is not an issue with the Gershom, it's an issue basically any cemetery, is that many times, especially when you're doing the burial, and there's a lot of people, it's practically impossible for people not to be stepping over other people's graves that are within the vicinity. So this actually addresses the point. The Taz Paskins, and this in the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch as well. Yeah, check your WhatsApp, sir, when I sent you the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. She'ein Isser im dorech al kever lefi shah. One is allowed to temporarily step on top of another grave. Behilach makom sherotzim leilech sham. If you're trying to get from one place to the other, it would seem that one is allowed to pass over another individual's grave. And the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch tells us im ein lo derech el im kein yidrach. And if this is your only option, then you may do it. It seems to be expanded a little bit. Some people seem to take the liberty of standing on top of the grave. My advice would be is that if you can't get from point A to point B, you can temporarily walk over a grave site if you have no other choice, but you should try to not remain on top of another individual's grave. So that's the, so I know Erwin had that question. I see some nods, so I assume that many of you were mechavein to Erwin's question as well. And so just so happens to be, I saw this and I thought of the question that was raised the other day. Okay, moving on to the next Mishnah, Rabbosai. Back to our feature presentation. Let's talk about laning. And you know, you thought that this whole entire chapter, we're basically wishing farewell to Purim and Megillah and all that. Well, guess what? We have some halachas coming up that are going to be very relevant for us very soon. Rosh Chodesh Adar Shechal Yos B'Shabbos. So, as we might be aware, there are 4 special maftirs that we read during the month of Adar, and here they are. Rosh Chodesh Adar Shechal Yos B'Shabbos Korban B'Parshas Shkolim. The first one is when Rosh Chodesh Adar falls out on Shabbos, we read Parshas Shkolim. Chal Yos B'Tocha Shabbos, if it falls out in the middle of the week, Makdimin L'Sha'avar. So then we lane Shkolim the Shabbos preceding Rosh Chodesh Adar, Umaftigim L'Shabbos Acheres, and then we take a break the following week. B'Shnia Zachor. Then the second reading is Parshas Zachor preceding Purim, in which we read about it makes sense thematically, the Amalekim, and how we have to destroy them. The Shlish is Para Aduma. The third is Para Aduma. Revius Hachocha Zelechem. Just very briefly, the logic behind the 4 readings is as follows. Shkolim, we're going to talk about in the Gemara momentarily, because 30 days, basically, we need to have the Shkolim collected for the month of Nisan, so offerings can be brought on Pesach. So the Shkolim needs to be collected a month ahead of time, which just so happens to be Chodesh Adar, which precedes Nisan. So it actually has nothing to do with Purim. It just happens to be that Chodesh Adar is 30 days before Chodesh Nisan. Then the next parsha we read is Parshas Zachor, which of course actually relates to Purim, destroying Amalek. Haman was an Amaleki. And then the third parsha is Para Aduma, which talks about purity. We need to know these laws so people are conscious when they're coming up for Pesach, they're coming up to the temple, they should be conscious of purity laws. And then finally, and Chodesh Zelachem, which is laning that actually pertains to the upcoming holiday of Pesach. So that's the logic behind them. And then Bechamishes goes through like the Sidron, and then after that, back to our regular laning schedule. Okay. The Chol Mafsika. Now, for all these other things we're going to mention in a moment, we are mafsik the regular, they'll be mafsik the regular laning or mafter during the week, depending how it falls out. For Rosh Chodashim, as we know, if Rosh Chodesh falls out on a weekday, so then it takes over. We don't lane the upcoming Parsha, we lane Rosh Chodesh. And if it falls out on Shabbos, then it becomes the maftir. The Chanukah B'Purim, and a similar phenomenon comes up with Chanukah and with Purim as well, that they overtake the standard laning during the week. And for Chanukah, you have the maftir on Shabbos. Of course, Shabbos Rosh Chodesh Chanukah is one of the most infamous times to be in shul. I imagine take off that week. It was great. But Tanis Mamados, and finally, we talk about on fast days and during Mamados, in which the Israelim would be on shifts to lane and fast while their counterparts were serving the Beis HaMikdash, and on Yom Kippurim as well. Yom Kippur's on Shabbos, also similar phenomenon takes place. Okay. Now, the Gemara, let's just get into the Gemara here. That way we can get on to the next page, next Amud. Tnan Hassam, we're now going to talk about, as we said at the beginning of the Mishnah, the beginning of Adar, where the Shabbos preceded Rosh Chodesh Adar, we lane Parshas Shkalim. So what's the logic behind this? Tnan Hassam, we learned in a Mishnah can anyone guess where this Mishnah can be found? The CAS? Shkalim. Yeah, Shkalim. Right, we're talking about Shkalim. Okay, right? Right. And then now I'm worried because you guys are all staring at me like I'm crazy. I'm pretty sure. Okay. Anyway, the Echav Adar Mashmin al Shkalim. On the 1st of Adar, we inform everybody to start allocating their Shkalim. Ba'aklayim, and likewise, we warn everybody, you better watch out because Bastin's coming to town. And we're going to make sure that there's no climb, there's no mixed breeds of plants in your yard. Bishlam climbs Mount Suriyahi. I can understand why they Bastin will send their shluchim, send their agents out during Chodesh Adar, because people are planting during Chodesh Adar. That's when climb is most likely going to be present. But where do we get this idea that at the beginning of Rosh Chodesh Adar, we all of a sudden have to start announcing to people to get their wallets ready to give shkalim? Minalan, where do we infer this from? Amarav Tavi Amarav Yoshi Adamar Kra Zos Olas Chodesh Bechadsho Amra Torah. This is the play on the language here. Kadesh v'Havdei Karba Mitruma Chadasha. That you shall bring the truma from newly contributed funds to the Beis HaMikdash. Ukeva de Nisan bite, and since Nisan, right, you have the whole dispute about when the world, what's the beginning of the year. So for our purposes here, Nisan is the beginning of the year. Ukeva de Nisan bite, since we need the funds ready for the beginning of Nisan, Akruve mitruma chadasha. Therefore, we bring it. Sorry, Akruve mitruma chadasha. Therefore, since at Nisan, it needs to be brought from the new donations. Therefore, 30 days prior to Rosh Chodesh Nisan is Rosh Chodesh Adar. So that's why we have to begin laning Parsha Shkalim in order so everyone is aware of the obligation to give Shkalim. Now, let's just go slightly further and then we'll conclude. Come on. This would seem to not be. This would seem to be a point of dispute. It would seem that Rosh Gamliel would not agree that one lanes Parsha Shkalim as early as a month prior to Rosh Chodesh Nisan. How do we see this? Because there's the following dispute. Rosh Gamliel, over Shtei Shabbosos, because Rosh Gamliel says you only need to prepare 2 weeks in advance. Netanya. That the Brisa teaches us that we are supposed to begin learning the laws of Pesach 30 days prior to Pesach. And then we extrapolate that to all other Yom Tovim. And there's like this, I haven't gone through it yet, but there's this really great 2-volume set called Shlosh Yom Kodem Chag, in which I forget what his name is, but this rabbi, Talmud Chacham, he basically scheduled, he had like a schedule for every day of the year, you like learn another range of halachos. So that way, he schedules that like 30 days in advance of every Yom Tov, you're learning the relevant halachos that you need to know prior to it. So it's called Shlosh Yom Kodem Chag, 30 days prior to the holiday. However, Rosh Gamliel or Shtei Shabbosos, only 2 weeks prior to Pesach, is when you need to start asking questions. So, I mean, we'll find it all the time. Some people ask their questions before Purim. Some people ask before Chodesh Adar. Some people ask their Pesach questions 30 minutes before Pesach. So, it's a whole range of people when they ask their questions. So Rosh Gamliel thinks that you only need 2 weeks of advance notice. So it seems, according to Rosh Gamliel, therefore, you would only need 2 weeks in advance of Chodesh Nisan. In middle of Adar is when we would read Shkalim. However, Lav Dafka, because actually, even Rosh Gamliel would say that you lay Parsha Shkalim at the beginning of the month of Adar. How so? Kiv Damar the Chamisha Asar Boshel Chanos Yoshim b'Medina, b'Chafe Yoshim b'Mikdash, Mishum Shulchanos Kadminan Ukarina. So here's the idea. Even though the Shkalim need to be at the Beis HaMikdash by the beginning of the month of Nisan, the folks from the Beis HaMikdash, from the National Bank of the Beis HaMikdash, would set up shop and exchange tables in the various villages and provinces 15 days prior to Chodesh Nisan. And so since people would only really start donating halfway into the month of Nisan, so it actually makes sense that even Rosh Gamliel would say, well, 2 weeks prior to the middle of Adar is when you should start leading Shkolim. So even Rosh Gamliel holds you only do 2 weeks prior. It doesn't mean 2 weeks prior to Nisan. It means 2 weeks prior to when people should really start giving their contributions, which is in the middle of the month of Adar. So therefore, you go 2 weeks back, you get reading of Shkalim on Rosh Chodesh Adar. So anyway, that is what we do. That's the halacha. And God willing, we'll talk more about this next time. So, shkayach everybody. Wishing you all a wonderful Shabbos. Again, if no one has any strong opinions about what should be our candidates for our next Masechta, I will send you an email with the 3 choices. And then from there, you can let me know if you have any preference. If no one comes out with any strong preferences, then I'll just choose one and I'll try to give you advance notice. That way you can order yourself a Gemara should you need to do so. All right. Very much looking forward and wishing you all a good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.
Shabbat.